And welcome back to the show. We're talking to Dr. Anthony Campbell, who is a professor of College of Public Services at Tennessee State University. The topic, gentrification and its effect on housing. And before we took a break, Dr. Campbell, you talked about the importance of multicultural groups coming together in order to kind of make sure we've got a plan in place to fight for the things that we believe in as far as our neighborhood is concerned. How do you even get started with that? Because in this day and time, there are folks that may not know their neighbors, right?
Yes, yes, there's many people who don't.
Old neighborhoods don't, where the neighbor down the street knew the kids on the block and all that. Sometimes those don't exist in our newer neighborhoods. So how do you really pull together?
Right, so I think we have to begin from a position where we realize that that this can't just be an issue that impacts minorities, this can't just be an issue that impacts poor people, right? This has to be an issue that's understood as impacting Nashville as a whole, right? So we have to begin there, and I think we have some history we can draw on that is a positive signal. In the 1960s, we talked before the break a little bit about urban renewal and some of the efforts that destroyed some cities both here and elsewhere. And in the 1960s, you had the original Rainbow Coalition, which was the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, and the Young Patriots, and some very important leadership in the Black Panther Party saying we cannot let them divide us. If they divide us, they will conquer us. So we must come together and realize urban renewal affects all of us. And I think we have to do that here in Nashville, right? It's easy to say, oh, it's just happening in this neighborhood, it's just happening in this other neighborhood. But anyone who's been here for a while realizes it's happening in all neighborhoods. Yeah. So I think that's where, to answer your question, I think that's where it's important for the government to step in and facilitate some of this dialogue, begin to facilitate some of these collaborations. And it can't just be the government, right? We know we can't just rely on Metro Nashville government to do this. It's going to have to be the government partnering with nonprofits, partnering with members of the private sector, so we can have this dialogue that encompasses everyone. Because if only one group gets to define what gentrification is in Nashville, the likelihood is that those with power, therefore those with a lot of economic power, may get to define it, and we will all potentially suffer from that.
What's your definition of it as it stands now? Yeah,
as gentrification is right now, and this is part of the dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Is it's both, there's the physical aspect of it, right? So it's the changing of housing stock, changing of neighborhoods, so there's this physical dimension, and then there's also this cultural dimension, which is typically the displacement of people who have historically occupied an area, right? And that's bound up in the the Webster's definition of gentrification, right? To make someone more polite or more refined, right? So it's this application of historic gentrification of a person to a space in a city. So, and that's what we're seeing in Nashville, right? This is why people are hesitant until you will hear people say, I may look at houses there when it gets to a certain point, right? And it's that point of refinement or politeness of a neighborhood that they will then maybe consider to invest or something like that. So there's the physical part, and then there's the cultural part of gentrification. And unless we're looking at both of them, then we're very risky, that we're very vulnerable to gentrification taking hold and continuing to distort what Nashville is.
So for the most part, you believe in the importance of growth in a community, right? Growth in neighborhoods, but it's important to find that balance. So how do you do that?
Well, I think this is why we have to have more people involved, right? And this is the obligation that falls on government, right? To get more people involved and meaningfully involved. As you said,
there's fear sometimes
there's
in government being
there's
involved, because
fear.
Then you feel like you're pressured or pushed into doing something,
right? But
and don't have a voice.
Certainly, 100%. And I think this is what we've seen over time in other cities that have been successful in overcoming gentrification, or at least holding off some of the negative effects. And this is, at the College of Public Service, we had our Black History Month event in February, and we brought together different groups to have this dialogue. It was an event we called Gentrification Across the Spectrum, and what we recognize is we have to get different groups together talking about this issue, right? And it can't be government taking necessarily the leadership role. They need to be at the table, right? They can't be forcing it. They can be facilitating it sometimes. But I think that's, to what you said a moment ago is, I think most people want economic growth, right? There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong with it is when not everyone's benefiting, right? It has to be equitable economic growth, right? And that event we had in February, it was about the city of Portland and a neighborhood there where they began to experience a lot of economic growth, and the people were very excited. But then they began to realize over time, oh, this isn't going to be for us. This is going to be for other people, right? And that's what we have to prevent. That's what we have to work together, band together to prevent. Because otherwise, we don't just have people getting displaced from neighborhoods, we have the history of Nashville getting displaced from this place along the river, right?
Are there examples, because the reality of equitable economic growth, is that really real? Are there examples of cities that have done it right, I guess is what I'm looking for?
There have been patches of cities that have done it right, with a lot of protections. I think what you have to do is you find cities around the country that have implemented measures. I mean, one of the hidden ways that people get pushed out that we were talking about earlier is you get priced out with property taxes, right? Right. So suddenly, your home's still the same as you described, the 3 tall skinnies, and you have your family home, you've been there for 2 generations, but then suddenly the neighborhood property value goes up, and now, whoa, I can't pay this bill, I guess we got to move, right? Right. So protections for people that have lived there, I think we've seen that in some big cities, New York City, Minneapolis, parts of San Francisco, though it's frequently a poster child for failure with this. But yeah, so I think I think it's a little bit of legal protection for people that have lived there, a little bit of legal prioritization of history, prioritization of neighborhoods, that neighborhoods matter. And then it's also this more complicated banding together dialogue part, right, where we have to get people involved to discuss this issue and make sure, because gentrification is different everywhere, right? It's different in different parts of Nashville, and we have to focus. Right, this definition of gentrification is something everyone wants to know and everyone asks, understandably, but the definition, I think, is less important than the experience of gentrification. And that's why we have to get neighborhoods involved, we have to get leaders involved in those neighborhoods, not just people with power, but people with history, and what does it mean and how are you affecting it? Because the lived experience of gentrification is what we need to know in those neighborhoods in order to prevent it from becoming worse.
You talk about the conversation that you led a few months ago when you talked to the city of Portland and showed that example of what was going on there. What are next steps, though, for you when it comes to your work and your research and what you want to see happen in some of our neighborhoods in Nashville?
Right. Well, the big thing I research is how do governments begin to work with citizens, right? Because as you said earlier, there can be fear, there can sometimes be manipulation, right? We have already decided the 3 options we want and we present them to you. What my research focuses on more broadly, one aspect of it, is authentic civic engagement, authentic citizen engagement, right? Citizen empowerment. And I think that's the cities that are making good steps forward and serve as some good examples. They are going through the long, often laborious process of developing genuine relationships with citizens, right? Where they truly feel empowered, where they feel as though they can be authentic and real in that dialogue with their government. Because unless you get there, then something like gentrification, you can't even agree on what day of week to meet, let alone how do you begin to tackle a very complicated issue, right? So I think that's the first step. And we've had some positive examples here in Nashville, right? But if we are the it city, if we're a city that's defined by our artistic offerings to not just the U.S. but the world, then I think we should embrace that creativity that defines us and really be a laboratory for how do we begin to address communal issues like gentrification. And so I think that's really what we should focus on.
It's interesting because I was in Chicago just last week, and I was approached by a colleague of mine that said that he had been seeing advertisements on TV there about Nashville being this it city, and knew of a lot of folks moving here. We've long for years had a number of transplants. I'm a transplant to Nashville, although this is home for me now. But so I guess I'm wondering, as we continue to see not only our neighborhoods change, but the people coming to us because we are now the it city, how do we continue to balance what we want for our neighborhoods and our communities with all the stuff that's coming at us?
Yeah, I think that's anyone who's lived in Nashville for a long time is excited at the economic growth that's happening here, right? But there's also people who for now years have realized this can become bad very quickly, right? That this isn't just inherently good, right? In the same way that gentrification doesn't have to be inherently bad, economic growth is not inherently good, right? So I think that equitable economic development we talked about, I think you asked the next step. I think what we have to do is we have to engage in some dialogue, but it can't just be talking, right? We as academicians are sometimes really good at touting the importance of dialogue and multicultural dialogue, and that really matters, right? And intersectoral collaboration, these things really, really matter, but there has to be that next step. People have to decide to act, right? Whether that's in the voting booth, whether that's at a city council meeting, right? People have to decide to act, and I think that's what I talk about are the 3 Ds in my classroom sometimes, is you have to define the issue, you have to have dialogue about the issue, then you have to decide to act about the issue. And that third part is hard, it's scary. There's, as we know, the great strides we've made in this country sometimes result in being at the end of another person's baton, right? But if we are going to tackle an issue like gentrification that has so much money involved and has so much, therefore, political power, political sway potentially involved, then we're going to have to decide to act. And we're going to have to work together instead of having turf wars based on skin color or socioeconomic status.
Is there another session that you have coming up, a public-facing session to kind of continue that conversation and that dialogue, as you put it?
We don't right now. We're not sure what our next event will be, but at the College of Public Service, what we're always looking for, what is really the spirit or essence of our college, is looking at those issues and getting outside of the classroom, right? We're really big on empower. The event we had in February was student-defined, student-driven. So we want our students to be out in the community developing these issues, making these events, right? Bringing people together.
Thank you so much, Dr.
You're
Anthony
so very
Campbell.
welcome.
I appreciate the conversation, and thank you for joining us. We will see you again next time.